The SynchroMystic presents SynchroMystique. What I'd like to do is simply give you leads. I don't have the time. I can't justify the time. I have other projects that I am in the middle of, and everything just takes me a long time. Not that good with scheduling. So what I thought I would do, though, since this issue is hot, is simply just record my thoughts. So we'll see how this goes. Let me know in the comments if you like this, don't like it. I thought I would give it a try. One of the things that I thought I would indicate is sort of let you in on my thinking process when I evaluate a case as to whether or not it would be worth exploring at greater length. And this case has a number of earmarks. So one of them seems to me to be the media's, if not omniscience, and we'll put a caveat on that, their declaration before the suspect is even in custody that they have the identity or that they have, motivations. They've got the manifesto, they know the background, and they start presenting an entire case when there's no one even in custody. Of course, now the person being blamed is in custody. This was not the case when the reporting was first released. It's interesting that from a psychological point of view, they don't declare themselves to be omniscient. Rather, they couch what they say in language like this from the CNN article title, "What We Know About the Minnesota Shooting Suspect," or "Here's What We Know So Far." So they give the impression that they're being fair, that they're looking into things thoroughly, and they're just going to go so far as what they know, and then they're going to tell you what they don't know. I think, in other words, it disarms the audience, because if they just simply declared a name and gave you a full description, people might go, well, how do they know that? But if they couch it in language of, well, here's what we know so far, we know certain things, then it makes it seem like they're doing a careful investigation, which, of course, I don't see much evidence of time and again. So that's a major sign from my point of view, or a major red flag, if you like. Of course, the most obvious point about the reportage is that they indicate the shooter, whoever he was wearing a mask. So, for example, in a CNN article titled "Extensive Planning and a List of Names," under the photograph and caption, we read, "Heavily armed and dressed in tactical armor with a silicone mask hiding his face and a police-style badge, Vance Bolter made a convincing police officer, ... How the identification was made, given the fact that the individual is wearing a mask, is not stated. A further obvious point is the fact that the word manifesto is attached to Bolter, that he supposedly wrote some kind of manifesto. They discovered the manifesto before the guy was even arrested, and of course they've analyzed his writings to the point where now they can make definitive declarations about them, not even a week out from the shooting event. And this, to me, is language that suggests rather strongly that we're talking about some kind of a psychological warfare operation or intelligence operation of some kind. The same kind of language you find connected with the Unabomb case and many others beside. Another name in the news is this Praetorian, as in Praetorian Guard Security Services. The word Praetorian refers to the bodyguard troop that used to guard Roman commanders or emperors. According to Etymology Online, it also can refer to defenders of an existing order. His biography here, probably written by himself, also indicates that he was the CEO of Praetorian Guard Security Services, based in Minnesota. Now, the Minnesota connection is quite interesting itself. It came up in the case of George Floyd, of course. So here we have Melissa Hortman, the murdered congresswoman, and it says she lived in Brooklyn Park, Minnesota. Brooklyn Park, Minnesota was also the same place that Jesse Ventura was mayor of for a little bit before he became governor of Minnesota. Ventura was the mayor from 1991 to 1995. Now, what's interesting about Ventura is that, of course, he gets into a lot of quote-unquote conspiracy theorizing. He used to have a show themed around that. Former professional wrestler, whatever. Ventura somewhere said that when he was the governor, he made note of the fact that the Central Intelligence Agency introduced itself to him in the governor's mansion as part of business as usual in their local politics. And I'm not saying that this is any different in other states. But I recall, although I'm not going to look up the full citation here, that Ventura basically stated that the CIA had connections, and he even commented at the time, they're not supposed to be chartered for domestic counterintelligence or intelligence. So he thought, at least professed to think, or to even say to them, that it seemed to him unorthodox. Of course, we made note of the fact that the Twin Cities are interesting. I think I mentioned that in the George Floyd video. There's an entire subset of this symbol pattern that suggests there might be something to this security business. In one place, the major media, of course, is trying to downplay this by suggesting that his security ambitions were just a, quote, fantasy. However, that word fantasy is quite interesting. It reminds me of the introduction of the words novel and fairy tale into the JFK symbol complex. And for details of that, you can see, I think I mentioned that in Time Relations, maybe. Michael Hoffman and James Shelby Downer, of course, are the go-to for the JFK assassination symbol complex in, for instance, King Kill 33. But the word fantasy and the fact that the media is drawing attention to a security tie here, whether it's real or imagined, is beside the point from the standpoint of the story. And what I think is interesting about that is the fact that just a few days before this shooting, whoever did it, there was a cache of documents released to some media fanfare regarding the assassination of RFK, that is to say, Robert Francis Kennedy Sr. in 1968, which we covered, at least in part, in our video 1968. Once you get past Sirhan, who is the alleged assassin, and you start looking more carefully at alternative theories, one of the major ones endorsed by Robert Francis Kennedy Jr., RFK Jr., is the idea that his dad was murdered by a security guard named Thane Eugene Caesar. Now, I'm not going to pursue that here. For the details, see 1968. But my point is, here you have the release of documents regarding RFK's assassination. Possibly the true story of that was that he was murdered by a security guard who was moonlighting. I mean, almost certainly some kind of low-level intelligence asset is the point, but that his cover story, his way of getting into the Ambassador Hotel, was via this security connection. And similarly, we have a few days after the release of those documents, the allegation that we have this other gentleman in Minnesota, alleged assassin, also with a security background, which again, in connection with other ties, the Congo and so on, suggests rather strongly that there's some intelligence aspect to this case. On a quite separate wavelength, but interrelated, of course, we'd want to look at the dates that are involved, at least the dates the media points to. So June 14th is a prominent one. Another interesting facet of the case was that these shootings were said to have occurred early Saturday, June 14. In 2017, on June 14th, that's the date that in Wikipedia summary, Republican U.S. House Majority Whip Steve Scalise of Louisiana and 3 others were shot and wounded while practicing for the annual congressional baseball game. So there was another high-profile attempted assassination on June 14, 2017. Of course, other news items from exactly the same day, June 14, 2025, include Donald Trump's 79th birthday, the military parade that he threw in Washington, D.C., which was supposed to coincide with, in addition to his birthday, the U.S. Army's 250th anniversary. And in protest of that, there was the No Kings activities at various cities. And of course, Bolter Belter was also said to have been found with No Kings flyers. At least they were found in what has alleged to have been his car. One would have to look into and make judgments about how substantial any of these angles are, but the date itself was certainly charged by the media, charged with symbolic importance, if you like. Of course, the astrological sign ascendant on June 14 is Gemini, which is also known as the Twin. Of course, Minnesota and St. Paul are both together known as the Twin Cities. So now we have a symbol complex with Minneapolis nearby, at least according to the location of the congressperson who was killed along with her husband, which would be Brooklyn Park. Incidentally, the Gemini symbol complex also showed up in the Castor-Pollux connection with regard to the DC mid-air collision that we covered in January, I think it was, or December. June 14 is also Flag Day. And of course, the connection with the politicians who were killed and wounded. John Hoffman, a senator in Minnesota who, along with his wife, was not killed but was wounded. And his district includes the Twin Cities, according to his Wikipedia article. Of passing interest is the fact that the alleged shooter's last name is spelled with an O-E vowel combination that used to be written as a composite character called the Ethel or Ethel ligature, and which is sometimes further associated with runology. We got into runology in 10 Nazi Occultists Part 2. This vowel combination has also given rise to at least 2 pronunciations of Mr. Vance Luther's surname, with some newscasters saying Bolter and others opting for Belter. A similar duality has been a feature of other events, such as 9/11, when Osama bin Laden was occasionally called Usama. Another interesting possibility raised by commenters on Facebook is that Bolter may have been the recipient of USAID or USAID money, and that his Red Lion group may have been the recipient of those funds. If that's the case, this commenter wonders whether or not this is fallout from the redirection of USAID to Marco Rubio's State Department. In other words, did Bolter lose funds? This, of course, assumes that a case can be made that Bolter was the actual gunman, and I think there's ample reason to at least question that, but assuming he was involved, it still raises the issue of why, and this possible motive, namely if he had had funds cut under USAID, that might fill in some of the missing pieces. Another feature of the case that's quite interesting to me is that it's associated with a phrase that's common in alchemy, that occurs in alchemy, namely the Red Lion. So supposedly Bolter was the, quote, CEO of something called the Red Lion Group, the actual purpose of which is somewhat obscure. Of course, the Red Lion in Voltron was piloted in the television show in the 1980s by a character named Lance. That's possibly going a bit too far to connect the character Lance in the Red Lion to the character of Vance with his Red Lion group. For those who are inclined, you might tease out some further information that might make that a little bit more plausible. Of course, the Vance name is in the news quite a lot, given that the current vice president is James David J.D. Vance. At least that is what he is known as. As Wikipedia informs us, his birth name was James Donald Bowman. According to Dennis William Houck, the Red Lion represents the blood, or the life force in the blood. That's one of its meanings. Other lines of alchemy include the Black Lion and the Green Lion. One helpful way of thinking of these, arranging them, is as the planet Earth, with the green on the surface, the black soil underneath the green, and in the center of the Earth, the roiling lava volcanic area that would represent the red inner core. When the blood is hidden, this symbolizes life. And of course, when the blood is exposed, as we are all too familiar in crime dramas, this symbolizes death. There's a famous depiction of 2 of these lions on the so-called Ripley scroll. We mentioned George Ripley in our video on Top 10 Alchemists. And there's an obvious connection, so it's said, between the Red Lion and the red or rubedo phase of alchemy that we've gotten into before. And on at least one construal, the rubedo phase, the red phase of alchemy, is the third and final phase of the quote-unquote magnum opus or great work. And therefore, you could think that the Red Lion is a kind of a symbol of the Philosopher's Stone itself, the fabled goal, or one of the fabled goals of alchemy. So the fact that this phrase is associated now with this case is quite interesting, at least suggestive to me. Of marginal interest is the fact that you can connect a Peter Thiel operation to something called Black Lion. Black Lion, of course, would be one of the alchemical lions. But again, this would just be a symbolic link, the bolter connection with Red Lion, and then you would go off looking at other institutions, companies, operations, whatever, that have some kind of alchemical label using the word lion. And in doing that, just briefly, you can turn up some somewhat interesting connections. As far as the symbolism of the red lion, if it was indeed somehow based in the Congo, whatever that means for an American to have a business, quote, based in the Congo, if you look at the iconology or the iconography for the Congo, you see that the coat of arms has prominently displayed a red lion. Of course, on alchemy, the green lion is another prominent one. Isaac Newton had a lot to say about the green lion. So did Michael Meyer. It's also interesting that at least one article states that Vance Bolter lived in Green Isle, Minnesota himself. So as part of this alchemical symbol complex involving black, green, and red, it's interesting to note that the Green Isle was his alleged area of residence. And of course, then we could explore other connections to the Green Lion. We could explore the fact that Ireland is often called the Emerald Isle, that the alchemical treatise called the Emerald Tablet was a prominent text that Isaac Newton, for instance, and other alchemists paid attention to, and on and on. And before we change topics, here's one more thing on the Red Lion group. According to at least one source, it seems to have been based out of the Democratic Republic of Congo, as it's known now, previously known as the Belgian Congo, and for an extended period of time it was known as Zaire. Here's where it says Bolter's Red Lion group is based in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The Congo has a quite curious history. For one thing, there was an alleged CIA-connected assassination of an activist there by the name of Patrice Lumumba. Lumumba was a politician who was elected the first prime minister of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and this would have occurred around the time that Kennedy was assassinated, and my recollection is that Lumumba may have been supported by Kennedy and people in his administration, and I think David Talbot, in his book The Devil's Chessboard, suggests that Kennedy was dismayed at Lumumba's assassination, which was blamed on internal forces within the Congo, and that a general by the name of Mobutu, I believe, took over after that. And this is just another example of almost certainly a CIA-instigated coup, or a country that was, quote, threatening to turn democratic in some fashion that is unacceptable to U.S. business interests. The military dictatorship is installed in order for the reins to be kept on the population so that the resources of the country can be exploited for international banking gain or for whatever corporations come in. And you have to bear in mind that the Congo is rich in resources. And in fact, the Congo is supposed to be one of the richest areas in the world when it's construed from the perspective of its natural resources. The Congo is a place that the U.S. has been interested in for a long period of time, not only in terms of active there assassination-wise, almost certainly an attempt to get U.S. business interests there to try to take advantage of its resources. And here you find this Bolter fellow, allegedly connected with evangelical preaching, or whatever the story is supposed to be. The Red Lion group, whatever its actual function, security, it's very vague, and it's unclear exactly what the function is. But nevertheless, the fact that the Congo is implicated in all of this, again, is quite interesting to me. Various companies in the U.S. are said to have ties with the Congo because it is so rich in resources. So a full look at the total picture might reveal some interesting connections there. On the Wikipedia page for the Democratic Republic of the Congo, we read about how the mining sector has been responsible for much of the DRC's economic growth in recent years. There's a huge reserve of cobalt. It's a major producer of copper and diamonds and many other resources, which you can read about here. Then we find a very interesting phrase that due to its resources, it is economically the Saudi Arabia of the electric vehicle age. I mention this because if a person thinks Congo is a fairly out there connection, it would be wise to at least reflect on the fact that it is so rich in resources and what that would imply for U.S. business interests. It would imply that the Congo is a hotbed of intelligence activity, as various powers in the world, including the United States, try to vie for position, certainly with not only electric vehicles, but smartphones and other technology that would use the various cobalt or copper or whatever, miscellaneous items. One commenter on a local television station's article post on Facebook says, quote, "It was obviously at least 2 shooters. It would be impossible to travel the distance even with all green lights," meaning the distance between all of the places that Belter was supposed to have been. On that same token, another newscaster said, quote, about Belter, "How he's getting around is a mystery." Of course, I can't comment here on the accuracy or on the geography. However, this would certainly be a lead that one would want to pursue in a full excavation of this case. A second word that crops up here, in addition to the word fantasy, is nightmares. And of course, this word figured in some of the corona/COVID stuff. The fact that being shut in or fear of pandemic or whatever was causing people to have nightmares. But here again, it's no exaggeration to say that his crimes are the stuff of nightmares. Vance Bolter is said to have had ties with various food companies, I presume in security, although it doesn't say in the articles that I skimmed, but it names Johnsonville, Del Monte, and 7-Eleven as amongst the companies that he was somehow affiliated with. Now, in each of these cases, it would be worth looking into the details of these companies. For example, do they have anything to do with the Congo? Who owns them? And so on. There are plenty of other leads, including ones that purport to implicate Minnesota's current governor, or that question the timeline in such a way as to suggest the complicity of law enforcement. Background information would have to make reference to the fact that federal intelligence agencies have long maintained the sorts of ties that would give these kinds of allegations at least a prima facie plausibility. These connections go back to the days of COINTELPRO and Operation Chaos. Finally, on a personal level, an acquaintance of mine who evidently participated in a number of ethically and legally questionable targeted military actions likened the choreography of such business to a macabre dance. And on that wavelength, we observe that Tim Walz's surname is a lexical close cousin to a certain style of ballroom activity characterized by a distinctive synchronized turning that coincides with a rhythmic rising and falling of the participants. On the other hand, maybe the whole episode was meaningless.
Everyone dies. Some die because they deserve to. Others die simply because they come from Minneapolis. It's random and it's meaningless.